in terms of the feed space requirement, and it's a really important one to get right, and it's a useful exercise to actually physically take out the measuring tape and get someone with you to actually measure the feed space, and not just to assume that you have enough. All ewes must be comfortably able to eat meal together. Very often we find when people maybe 6 or 8 weeks out from lambing with the likes of triplet bearing ewes, when they start feeding, it appears that they have loads of space, but it's not any smaller those ewes are getting from there on in.
Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. In this episode we hear extracts from a recent Let's Talk Sheep webinar where Sheep Specialist Damian Costello spoke to us about key management advice for at housing this winter. Damian covers various aspects from some of the challenges faced this year to managing condition to practical advice at housing. Now at the end we also hear from Damian responding to some of the audience questions on the topic. We hear first from Damian, who sets the scene.
There's no need to remind anybody 2023 has been a particularly difficult year on sheep. The story of the year has been rainfall. I saw some figures recently there that here in Athenry, in July there was 254% of the normal rainfall, and it was 119% for August. So there was a huge amount of rainfall in the second half of the year. This led to lower grass dry matter. Sheep were consuming grass that was only 12 or 13% dry matter. This, I suppose, in turn, as everybody knows, led to poor enough and challenging lamb drive. And I suppose the knock on to that was that people found themselves coming up to mating time, which was in less than ideal body condition, or certainly less than they would have been in previous years. And then, I suppose, coming into the autumn, I suppose grass supply appeared to be as normal, but what people were finding that it was disappearing quite quick. And, people's grass supplies dwindled maybe earlier than expected. And again, this was in part due to kind of the very poor underfoot conditions leading to poor utilisation. I suppose just as an introduction, in terms of body condition score, when we talk about body condition score and measuring body condition score, we're talking about a scale of 1 to 5, with the score of 3 to 3.5 being the ideal at this time of year. Really, as we always say, I suppose it's not about getting so hung up on whether a ewe is at 3 or 3.25 or 3.5. The key thing is that you're able to maybe pick out what ewes are thin. So even if you put it on a scale of thin, fit and fat, where you're hoping that most of your ewes are in the fit category, but that involves putting your hand through the wool and handling each sheep to pick out those thin ewes. You won't do it by just visually looking at them. Just to recap on a few of the targets, I suppose, we set out in terms of a body condition score. The idea would be that you build up the ewes to a body condition score of 3.5. That's the target average. And again, keeping the range as tight as possible so that you've addressed the issues of the thinner ewes in the 10 or 12 weeks prior to mating, in order to get them as high a proportion as possible of the ewes at or near enough the target. You'd like to think that you'd have few enough ewes under 3. And again, look at it as the season progresses right up to scanning. The idea would be that you'd maintain that body condition insofar as possible, and again, addressing any issues you'd have with outliers or that. At this stage, though, it's not too late. It's good management practice to maybe separate out the thin ewes from the group, as I say, picking out the thinner ones and giving them preferential treatment. So what are the options? They can be put into the shed on silage, and maybe a small bit of concentrates if the silage quality is not what you'd like it to be. Other people will take the option of having them outdoors and maybe supplementing them with a bale outside. Again, important that you ensure that you're cross compliant if you're feeding outdoors to the ewes. But the important thing is that they're separated out and they're treated and they're given preferential treatment. And some of you on tonight might say, where's he going with concentrates this early? we're only talking about the thin ewes at this stage. You're picking out the small percentage of ewes, hopefully, in the flock that's thin, and you're not overfeeding them. You're feeding maybe 300 to 500 grams per head per day, along with fairly good quality silage, or as good a quality silage as you have. And if you're doing this maybe for 40 to 50 days, up to the time of scanning, you're talking about in the region of €5 to €8 per head. So it's not a massive cost, and the benefit of it will be if you can build a little bit of body condition, that they're not lambing down in very poor condition. Again, as we know, the knock-on effect, if you have a high proportion of ewes that lamb down in poor body condition, you'll have very poor milk yield, you'll have poor mothering ability, you'll have lots of headaches and lots of problems. If the weather is particularly poor, probably the preferred option is indoors, because they're not using up energy to more or less keep themselves warm and that. So it's easier to put on a bit of body condition in housed ewes. Again, this year it's no secret that the availability of straw is tight, and the cost of it, even if you can get it, the cost of it is high as well. So the people will be tempted maybe to delay housing as a result of this, and maybe they have some straw, or they're trying to make a stretch or whatever. So again, in this situation, I suppose you must prioritise what ewes you have to house first. If you're going for a sort of a gradual approach to housing, I don't think the solution is to say, look, I'm not going housing, or I'm keeping them out a month longer and not doing anything any different. And an absolute no-no, I suppose, is regrazing fields that you've already closed up for spring grass. That grass will be far more valuable to you in the springtime, and don't be tempted to use that in order to keep the ewes out a bit longer. So where I suppose where housing capacity maybe can be an issue as well, but also where there's maybe limited straw, the first priority in terms of housing would be the thin ewes, because if you leave them outside with the main group, it's only thinner they will get. Secondly, maybe you'd be looking at older ewes. They're maybe more likely to have teeth issues, where they would suffer a dip in body condition as a result. When we get as far as scanning, then I suppose maybe the next batch you would be housing would be maybe the triplet bearing ewes, because pretty much fairly soon after scanning you'll be introducing concentrate supplementation to those ewes in order to meet their energy demands in the run up to lambing. And again, if you've done your rattling fairly successfully post scanning, maybe you can look at the first colour, whether, let's say, it was yellow, that you can house the yellow ewes. So that's maybe maybe just an example of how you might stagger the housing in that fashion. Again, down at the bottom of the page, there's a table there from the Department of Agriculture as a guideline to the straw requirement per 100 days. You can see that I suppose it's a good bit less, I suppose, if you're feeding hay or haylage type. And again, I suppose if you're trying to make best use of the available straw, if you're under the amount you need. The other important thing to bear in mind, I suppose, that your sheep housing is well ventilated. If you have a poorly ventilated building, you'll find it difficult to keep that bedding dry because there's a damp atmosphere in the shed, and there's health issues, I suppose, alongside that as well. Important, I suppose, to try and get as you're housing your groups of sheep, you can get them as dry as possible. Get the fleeces dry. If you house very wet sheep, your first bedding will go fairly quick. Again, some people use lime, particularly along the barriers, just before you bed. Other people are using putting sawdust underneath, and it can be a help, I suppose, in terms of stretching the straw that's available. So I suppose moving on then maybe to talk a little bit about sheep housing, and what are the key challenges we're coming across in sheep housing. Firstly, I suppose overcrowded pens, and in particular in a straw bedded situation, you'll struggle to keep the bedding into them. You'll struggle to keep the bedding clean. It also, I suppose, encourages bullying. The more dominant sheep in the pen will tend to bully the lighter ewes. So Again, in this situation, the thinner ewes are getting thinner, and they're not certainly putting on body condition. Um, the second thing, I suppose, that's important to examine, and we'll talk about the actual, the actual, the recommended feed space and floor space, but not enough feed space. The ewes that are less inclined to compete for feed will suffer where there isn't enough of feed space. And again, the stronger ewes and the more dominant ewes will get there first. And again, the knock-on effect to this is that you can have issues such as prolapse and also the metabolic diseases such as twin lamb disease and milk fever can be an issue, because just if there's lack of feed space, all ewes are not getting a fair crack at it. Again, I mentioned already in terms of issues with sheep housing. If you have poor ventilation in the shed, you'll have a sort of a constant damp atmosphere there, and again, you're using more straw as a result. And as I already mentioned as well, there's associated health issues with poorly ventilated buildings, and that there isn't the airflow to take harmful pathogens out of the environment. Other issues is maybe insufficient feed space for forage. It's important that you have a system in place that you can get constant access to the forage that you're feeding, and that is in front of them all the time. You're not allowing them to run out of it. Other issues with water, all very well having water trucks in each pen, but are they cleaned out regularly? Because they do get dirty, and it's something to keep a check on, particularly in the later stages of pregnancy when ewes are up on a high level of concentrate feed. They have a very high demand for water. In slatted pens, I suppose, again, sometimes it can be a challenge keeping the slatted areas clean. Again, depending on the forage that they're eating, if it's precision chopped silage, less of the material will be pulled in. We know, though, that on a lot of sheep farms, it's bale silage that's being fed in sheds. So again, regular cleaning out of any material that's pulled in at the feed face is a big help in terms of keeping this clean. And I know it's a chore, but it is worth doing before it gets a chance to block up the slats. Again, we'll have a look in a second at the recommendations. There's slightly less for slatted floors versus straw-bedded floors, but important to check the floor space. It's a good idea. So these are based on the Department of Agriculture S146 spec, the minimum floor space requirements. So this is the floor area they require. The large bodied ewes, the 85-90 kg ewes, they require 1.2 meters squared per head on slats. On the bedded, the straw bedded area, they require 1.4, and you can see down along the medium-sized ewe are slightly less requirements for that. Again, these are minimum requirements. There's nothing wrong with having a little bit of extra floor space. Some people often ask us, what about if we keep the ewes and lambs in after lambing? If you ewe with a single lamb, you add 30% onto the figures above on the table above, and if it's a ewe that's rearing twins, it's 60% over the above. If you're in the practice on your farm of winter shearing, they require 15 to 20% less floor space because of the fact that they're shorn just on the point of housing or just after being housed. In terms of the feed space requirement, and it's a really important one to get right, and it's a useful exercise to actually physically take out the measuring tape and get someone with you to actually measure the feed space and not just to assume that you have enough. All ewes must be comfortably able to eat meal together. Very often we find when people maybe 6 or 8 weeks out from lambing with the likes of triplet bearing ewes, when they start feeding, it appears that they have loads of space, but it's not any smaller those ewes are getting from there on in. It's, they will be getting bulkier. So again, for the large framed ewe, for meal feeding, you're talking about 600 millimeters per head is the recommended allocation, and it's important to check that. It is important to take account where you have walk-through feed trucks, that at the corners there's going to be about 600 millimeters blanked off. Say if there's ewes feeding across the front face, they will blank off the first space or two in the walkthrough track. So what we do in calculating the total feed space available is to take off 600 millimeters per corner when you're feeding on two sides of the pen, and it's if you have a three-sided feed, you're taking another 600 for the other corner. Some people ask us then, I suppose, in terms of sheep that are outwintered, again 300 to 500 millimeters of track space per ewe. That's assuming that they have access to feed on both sides of tracks in a field. So again, it's really important. And again, as I mentioned earlier on, the feeding space is really important from the point of view of metabolic diseases and also incidences of prolapse as well. Just in terms, I suppose, of the management at housing, it's important, and most people have done this already. It's important that your sheep housing has been cleaned out well in advance. You've done any power washing or disinfecting or whatever you want to do. Lots of people will put down a covering of lime as well on the floor before the bedding. So having the shed ready in good time, and also having it allowed it to dry out properly is really good practice. I mentioned already the risks with housing sheep with wet fleeces, along with, I suppose, the fact that the bedding won't last too long. There are other risks in terms of pneumonia or those type of things. So it is, insofar as possible, I suppose, if you can have sheep reasonably dry when they're housed. It's easier said than done, I suppose, with the weather we've been getting. Really important, I suppose, that you address any lameness issues before you house sheep. All yours should be put through the footpath before housing. And again, it's important, where possible, do not house lame sheep, because if you just turn in lame sheep, particularly if it's infectious lameness such as foot rot, it will just go through the shed. It'll spread rapidly inside. So pick out the lame ewes at that stage, treat them appropriately. Again, on veterinary advice, if you need to use an antibiotic for certain infections, and wait until the infection is fully cleared up before you house them. If you're in a situation where you must house them, separate them out and at least put them in a pen of their own, so that they're not spreading it throughout the flock. The worst case scenario, I suppose, you can have is if you have a couple of lame sheep in every pen in the sheds, they have a great chance of spreading it. Again, when we talk about penning ewes and dividing them up, as mentioned earlier at the start, you'll certainly be taking out the ewes in poorer body condition, and putting them, maybe housing them first and getting them on a fairly good, as the best quality silage, I suppose, that's available. And if it's required, a little bit of additional concentrates. After scanning, we'll be grouping them, obviously, based on litter size. And again, if you've done your rattling, as mentioned earlier, the later lambing ewes can be penned separately, or even if you're delaying the housing for some of them, they can be maybe remain outdoors for a couple of weeks longer. Again, from a practical point of view, sometimes we that seems like an awful lot of pens in a shed. But for example, if you have a group of triplets, you may pick out the twins that are in a little bit behind in terms of body condition, and they can be put in with the triplets, because they certainly can be put on a higher feeding regime, and you'll be starting feeding them that little bit longer. Again, using adequate straw. I know, as I said, the availability never some of it, but it's still not good practice to skimp on it in terms of keeping the environment clean. And very often, as I said, using the likes of lime, especially along feed barriers, can be a help in keeping the environment drier.
You cover a lot of practical elements of it already. Look, something we talk about the whole time, feed space. You brought it up again there. It's probably fair to say at the moment, like, if we looked at our pens and we say that's 600 mils for them large ewes, it looks a lot. But in reality, you have to account for what they're going to be in them final couple of weeks. It's one of the kind of pitfalls we see commonly.
Absolutely, yeah. And as I said, it is a very useful exercise. I mean, sometimes you'd be inclined to say, well, I always put 20 euros in that pen, or I always, and even within a shed, sometimes the whatever design features, even taking the walkthrough, it's maybe it's all in one bay of the shed, for example. It makes one bay of the shed that few feet smaller. So it is good practice to take it to measure it out. And there are other options. It's sometimes getting the balance between the floor space and the feed space is a challenge. But it can be as simple maybe as a simple sort of a hang-on trough on the other side of the pen that you can feed two sides and you can get around to put a bit. And that little hang-on trough that'll feed 3 or 4 ewes can make all the difference from it being putting sheep under serious pressure versus kind of they can all comfortably eat. And as you rightly said, when you start feeding maybe 6 or 8 weeks out from lambing, it all looks rosy and it looks like there's loads of space and that there's never going to be a problem. But as you say, they're getting much bulkier as you get nearer to lambing, and it's then the issues can arise.
It can change. Look, it's something I'm sure we'll come back to then. Look, you mentioned lameness. We've looked at a winter where a lot of ewes would have went in earlier, maybe bedding is a bit tighter. Could you maybe just offer me a couple of your key tips on keeping lameness at bay?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, as you said, it's probably a year where maybe sheep will be possibly in for that bit longer. Again, going through the sheep before you house them, making sure that you treat appropriately, separate out the lame sheep, treat them appropriately. Foot bath again as a preventative method. The remainder of the flock, pre-housing. You may need to for the clinical cases you may need to chat to your vet to get the appropriate antibiotic, and don't introduce them in with other sheep until they're fully cleared up. If you must house them, as I mentioned earlier on, maybe to house them in a separate pen of their own. The other thing, I suppose, sometimes people ask the question about foot bathing during the housing period. Look, you'll have yours out a couple of times, maybe into the handling yard. There's no problem in foot bathing yours in the late pregnancy period. But once it's done in a careful way, you're not running them around the yard or anything like that. So for once due care is taken and there's no obvious obstacles that are ran through tight gaps or that. And it is a good idea to do them if you have them out for their clostridial booster, to put them through the foot bath at that stage will help them, maintain it's a preventative, I suppose, as much as anything. But those are the few things I think here. Lime is useful, I suppose, from the point of view of keeping the bedding dry, and particularly in areas that are along the feed face where they spend a lot of their time, in particular concentrating on those areas. But it's a big help, and maybe around drinkers and that. So it keeps the atmosphere dry, and it's less conducive to lameness and the spread of lameness.
No, I think you're 100% right. Look at treatment support and look at the very basics there: segregate and reduce nervous or infection. You put them ewes in a separate pen. You're starting to cut down that challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Look, prolapse is one of the issues we see in farms. Maybe, Damien, I might ask you just comment on it from a point of view of, housing management, feed space.
Yeah, again, look at, as I say, the pen space, as far as we can see from situations we're coming across on the farm, it's one of the main things you can attribute to prolapse. And we mentioned it earlier on, I suppose, that when you start to feed concentrates, it may appear that there's lots of space and that they've loads of room and there's no big issue. As I said earlier on, check each pen to see that they have adequate and make the adjustments. And I suppose just the other comment you'd have, Kieran, is where you're feeding on maybe two sides of the pen, it's important that you can distribute that meal in a fairly lively fashion, that you're not maybe going all along the front barrier and then starting going up and down the middle barrier street. Each group of sheep as a separate group, and get the meal out to them as lively as you possibly can. So it is certainly a big factor to me.
If you look at, you touched on straw being scarce this year, it's a commodity we know. the use of alternatives and unconsciousness, it depends on where you are and how available they are, but the like using sawdust maybe incorporating in with the bedding, is that a viable option to try and stretch out the bedding this year as an alternative?
Look, possibly. I mean, there has been work done before looking at alternative beddings. You know, but in short, I suppose cleanliness was an issue with the alternatives really. That it was difficult to replace straw. What you mentioned there maybe is a possibility in terms of stretching out. A strawberry won't be a full replacement for straw. That maybe getting a bit of sawdust down as on the ground as a soakage, and getting a bit of straw on top as well. Again, we mentioned liming earlier on. That can be that can be a big help in terms of keeping your bedding drier, and as mentioned earlier, the things like making sure your ventilation is right, and if you have I suppose drier or higher dry matter feed stuff available, maybe you're opting for that as opposed to wet beds of silage in terms of keeping using less straw if it's in scarce supply.
Okay. Just a quick comment, Damien. Look, using it, build up a bed and build up a bacteria, getting that cleaned out pre-lambing. How close would you go to pre-lambing for cleaning that out?
I'd be if you had to, and it is an issue again. If the bedding is building up, I'd be going a month pre-lambing if you could to give yourself a chance to have it re-limed and re-bedded again, and that it's settled, that it's keeping your
that bit of a barrier there again.
Barrier between the infection, yeah.
We'll leave it there for this week's episode. A full recording of that Let's Talk Sheep webinar will be available on the Teagasc YouTube channel. That's it for me for this episode. For updates on our sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us for more episodes.